this is a German camp that most people don't see, and you just drive past it. But anyways, we'll have more battlefield things in a little bit. Let me see if I can. There we go. So this is a history class, so to speak. And I have to do a timeline at least. I have to list a few dates. So sorry for the date lessons. But really, if you step back in 1918, I mean, the 21st of March was when the first German offensive began, and they had 5 different offensives in the springtime, trying to knock the Allies out of the war before America came over and fired good enough power. So I put that date kind of as the beginning of this timeline. And the 28th of March, because of the advance that the Germans had made, Foch was named Generalissimo. And this was really the first time that you had much better coordination between the French, the British, and the AEF, the Belgians, on the Western Front in terms of conducting the battle. April and May, you get into heated discussions over how to use the AEF troops. I don't, you could spend 2 or 3 different seminars on that. On the 28th of May, elements of the 1st Division retake Cantigny. And again, just, we always hear that, but what's the significance of Cantigny? For those of you that don't know, that was one of the towns that the Germans obtained in that first German offensive on the Somme. And that's why it was a symbolic recapture of the town, so to speak. On the 27th of May, the Germans launched their 3rd offensive, and they start moving down towards the Marne River. By early June, the Germans have reached the Marne, and Pershing, American troops still aren't really over in large enough numbers to be an individual fighting force, but Pershing relents and rushes elements of the 2nd and 3rd Divisions to launch to stem the tide of the German advance. 15th of July is the date the last German offensive is launched, Operation Marschutz-Reims. On 18th July, so just 3 days after launching that initiative, sensing that the Germans had exhausted themselves, Foch orders what Americans call the Aisne Marne battle, and that included initially 6 American divisions and a couple of British divisions and a couple of Italian divisions, as well as mostly French divisions. And he launches that against the Germans and starts sending them back. On the 8th of August is the beginning of what the Brits call their 100 Days Offensive, and that's the Battle of Amiens, and that's known as Ludendorff's Darkest Day. So I would argue, but that's just me, that really you should look at the last 116 days as the turning of the tide, from 18 July to the 11th of November. The Brits take a look at it from the 8th of August to the 11th of November. So we get into August, and the American First Army is officially formed. Foch visits Pershing on the 30th. So the 10th of August, the First Army is officially formed, and they start making plans immediately for the St. Mihiel offensive. They dust off the plans that they had already started working on before. On the 30th of August, Foch visits Pershing and says, sorry, you're not going to do a full-blown offensive from St. Mihiel. We want you to cut that one short, just eliminate the salient, and we want you to move over to the Meuse Argonne, more or less. I mean, this is a very short view here, just because of the time. So on the 12th, the St. Mihiel offensive is launched. Most of you know it went from the 12th to the 16th. Immediately, the AEF starts shipping, relocating units and moving troops to get ready for the Meuse Argonne offensive, which is to begin on the 26th of September. Now, these last 3 dates that you can see on the slide, the important thing here is the Meuse Argonne was done in conjunction with the French offensive, the French Fourth Army's offensive in the Champagne region. Then 2 days later, the British and Belgians and French attacked in Flanders. And a day after that, the British were attacking in St. Quentin. So it's not just the Meuse Argonne offensive going on. We're side by side with the French. And then at the same time, or just a short while later, you have further attacks all throughout. The idea is to have attacks going continuously around the along the Western Front. So just to do a The 26th of September is when the offensive begins. There's a pause on the 30th because the initial divisions are quite messed up. Things are really getting entangled. Some units are replaced, especially the green units, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. On the 4th of October, the second phase of the Meuse Argonne begins. On the 16th of October, Hunter Liggett assumes command of the First Army. And on the 1st of November, the third phase of the Meuse Argonne begins. On the 11th of November, it's over. Again, very quick timeline, but I just wanted to set a few dates just so that we have that as a framework. Let's take a little look at the AEF troop buildup. Basically, at the end of December 1917, we had about 184,000 men in troops in France. And they weren't coming in that fast in the initial part of the year of 1918. By May of 1918, you can see on this, we're sending over 200,000 troops a month, which is a significant step up. And so if you look at the cumulative, the orange line with the axis on the right, by November 11th, we have about a little over 2 million men in AEF troops in France. And a little bit more than half of those are what you would consider service frontline combat troops. The other 45%, let's say, are services of supply and specialist units and things like that, hospitals, train workers, all the sawmill workers, et cetera. So it really, we don't get, critical mass, so to speak, until in terms of the number of troops that we could put into combat in France until kind of the middle of 1918 at best. And, that's without giving them a lot of chance of training. So really, even by September 26, we were pushing it, but the Germans kind of pushed our hands with the various spring offensives that we had talked about. Changing topics a little bit, and I'm gonna go over a lot of topics on a variety of things that just, as I say, hopefully to give you a different perspective on the Meuse Argonne, rather than talking about the individual action day by day, unit by unit, because I think some of these bigger picture items are kind of fascinating. And so when you look at this slide, the percentage of Western Front occupied by the Allies, what you see, the BEF is in orange, the AEF is in blue. By the end of August 1918, we are holding the same percentage of the front line as the British. And most people, if you ask the Brits especially, they wouldn't realize that as a percentage of front line held, we were holding the same percentage. But the real benefactor of this is the French army, because at the beginning of 1918, they're holding about 70% of the front line. And as the Americans move in, their percentage goes down to kind of the mid-50s, as you can see. Theoretically, all else being equal, that should give the French a much greater chance to rotate troops in and out, to maybe displace some divisions and put replacements into other divisions as needed. So, it's just something that people don't really realize, those two facts about the British not thinking that we held the same percentage and the benefits accruing kind of more or less to the French a little bit more than the British. So this is a geographic picture of and it's in Paul Bram's book, Meuse Argonne, The Test of Battle. But I like this map and I like the description that he gives. So I'm going to go ahead and read a section of this. It's about a paragraph long. The geography of the Meuse Argonne sector, about 18 miles east-west, is ideal for the attacker, ideal for the defense, deadly for the attacker. Facing the region, it is apparent the area is divided into three dominating features. The heights of the Meuse along the east bank, and here the heights of the Meuse along the east bank of the unfordable Meuse River, the hills of Montfaucon, here's Montfaucon, and the hills of Montfaucon in the center, with approaches from east and west, and the rising terrain of the heavily wooded Argonne forest, a plateau in the west of the zone. Obviously, here's the Argonne forest. Moving back east from the Argonne forest, the valley between the Argonne and Montfaucon is drained by the Aire River. and the Aire River runs through Verdun. Here it is right here, if you can see that on my showing it. Drained by the Aire River, the valley is narrow, dominated by the buttes of Vauquois and Montfaucon, and dissected further north into a maze of ridges and valleys connecting with the Barrois Plateau. The valley east of Montfaucon is intersected by east-west parallel ridges and ravines running east to the river. The heights east of the Meuse, running north-northwest along the eastern flank of the zone, provide observation over the eastern half of the sector. And we'll see that's fairly important going forward. And a lot of you have probably gone up to Ricine Hill to the heights, and you can see just what a beautiful observation view the Germans had. The wooded hills offer a multitude of concealment locations for machine guns to lay flanking fire on any advance on a north-south axis. So just to kind of talk a little bit about the geographic considerations for those of you that haven't been or haven't spent much time in the Meuse-Argonne. Logistical considerations, because of the time, I'm just gonna give a couple more paragraphs of reading that just gives a feel for the scale of this. Sal already mentioned it to some degree, but I think that this is good. It sets the scene. The staff work at Headquarters 1st Army involved in moving in a period of 12 nights over roads insufficient in number. The entire personnel and transport of 15 divisions cannot be grasped by a person unfamiliar with such tasks. And just for the record, 15 divisions of 28,000 men, more or less. Of these 15 divisions, 7 were involved in the Saint-Mihiel drive, 3 were in the sector in the Vosges, 3 in the neighborhood of Soissons, 1 in a training area, and 1 near Bar-le-Duc. To these must be added scores of batteries of French artillery, balloon units, American Army and Corps artillery, and other auxiliary troops. The routes of all were bound to cross more or less. Second quote and this is from Lawrence Stallings, The Doughboys. Moving up the vital support for the infantry that would soon plunge into the tangle of undergrowth and barbed wire was perhaps the biggest undertaking of all under the impromptu circumstances. There were 3,980 guns of all calibers that had to be in place by September 25th, the French crewing 1,464 of them, plus 40,000 tons of shells. Once they began firing, 14 trainloads of shells must feed them daily from 24 ammunition depots established at 19 railheads. The quartermaster needed 9 more depots. The engineers demanded 12 for supplies, 8 for water carts. Chemical warfare required 6. Trucks were going to transport 428,000 doughboys, 20,000 at a time, for an average haul of 48 miles. And these would need 9 depots for gasoline and oil. And, you know, when you go over and you visit the Western Front individually, in your own car with 2 or 3 people, maybe a buddy and yourself, you don't really stop and think of those numbers. And likewise, I reenact World War I, and even at our reenactment site where we get 500 to 600 people out, you still don't think of the immensity of that scale. So I thought that just put it into a nice perspective. Because of the Aisne Marne, the fighting that's still going on in the Aisne Marne, or what we would call the Oise-Aisne offensive, and the Saint-Mihiel offensive, one of the things about the Meuse-Argonne in the opening moves is some of our most experienced divisions, and again, that's, you know, units that have had combat for maybe 4 to 6 weeks maximum. Some of our most experienced, and not even that even, let's say 2 to 3 weeks maximum. Our most experienced units did not participate in the opening moves. And I'm assuming here that a fair number of you have some knowledge about the overall battle, and know that that was one of the weaknesses. So this is the order of battle without showing it on a map. You had the 1st Corps on the left, the 5th Corps in the center, the 3rd Corps on the right. And the 1st Corps was basically charged with getting through the Argonne Forest and getting the Germans out of the Argonne Forest. The 5th Corps taking Montfaucon and advancing well beyond Montfaucon, and the 3rd Corps anchoring the flank on the right, advancing up to the Meuse River. But without going into great detail, one of the things, because of the fact of where our troops were located at when we started moving them and preparing for this, you have 4 green divisions, the 35th Division and 1st Corps, and all of the 5th Corps divisions in the center. And they were supposed to be taking Montfaucon, which was very heavily defended, and moving and advancing beyond it. So what you really have is you have a combat situation where the 9 divisions in the front line, 4 of them had not seen any significant fighting, had not seen any fighting at all, and the others had seen some. So going back to Verdun, as I say, I hope to show Meuse Argonne in a couple of different lights. Most people know that the bulk of the Verdun offensive, well, the Verdun offensive started on the east bank of the Meuse River. So if you're looking at the map over here on the left, here's the Meuse River running down through, and here's Verdun. So this is where, so the offensive started out on the right side, or the east bank of the Meuse River. However, in 1917, the French counterattacked in August of 1917 and drove the Germans back. This is where the front line was at the end of, basically at the end of the Verdun offensives. And in August 1917, they drove the Germans back to this area. And what that means is when you go Avocourt, Malancourt, Bettencourt, and Forges, when you look at those areas, on the right-hand side of the map, I put that same map that I showed before, showing the geography of the area. And in the red circle, in the red oval area, is this piece of the front line. So essentially, the American jump-off lines from 1917, the American jump-off lines in September of 1918, were the French, what the French had retaken, and where their lines were at the end of that August, at the end of the August 1917 offensive. Again, you know, the similarities, and there's one more I'll show out in a little bit later, that the similarities between the Verdun and the Meuse Argonne, most people don't realize that half of the Meuse Argonne battlefield was essentially the old Verdun battlefield. So let's talk about German numbers for just a little bit. And I found this quite good. This shows rifle strength of Allied and German armies. I'm not sure exactly what they consider in rifle strength versus, I mean, I'm assuming not the support units and not aviation, et cetera. But you can see from here that even with the spring offensives, starting in March and going into July, until mid-June, the Germans had a numerical superiority in rifle strength versus the Allies on the Western Front. That starts to change in June, and it changes for 2 reasons. One is the casualties that the Germans are experiencing in their spring offensives, and of course the other that we saw was the increasing number of Americans coming in. And again, that hit 200,000 plus a month in May and continued on for most of that 1918. But what's really interesting is when you take a look at the September numbers, you can, by the 1st of September, German rifle strength was basically 82% of what it was at the June high. By the 1st of October, it dropped down to 75%. By the 1st of November, German rifle strength was at 53%. And at that point, the ratio of Allied to German riflemen in November is estimated to be 1.7 to 1. So you can definitely see how that the arrival of the American troops and the German casualties from their spring offensives really played a role in the exhaustion of the German army. And this is another picture to show some of that, and this is captures by the Allied armies. So the black line are prisoners, and the white lines are guns. And you can see it captures from July 18th to November 11th, 1918. And the British, the French especially, got lots of prisoners, way more than the Americans or the Belgians did. But still, you can see that that's another reason why those numbers moved very much in favor of the Allies as the war extended into late 1918. This is an example of the 236th Infantry Division, and they fought in the Meuse Argonne. It was a combat unit. It was brought in about the 29th of September, and it stayed in the line. Excuse me. It stayed in the line until the night of 11 to 12 October, and then it was pulled back and became an Angriff Division, counterattack division. And it stayed in the line, or it served in that position until the 20th of October. So from the 29th of September through the 20th of October, you can see the 3 infantry regiments had casualty rates between 61% and 73%. Just tremendous casualty rates. And for those of you that are interested, this was fighting right in the midst of things, right along Madeline Farm and to the right, to the east and west of Madeline Farm, right in the thick of things with the 3rd Division and the 32nd Division in that area. But you can see just how much of what's the right word, the casualties that the Germans were taking, even though we weren't advancing as rapidly as we would like to have, they were just getting pounded. Most of you, if you're familiar with the battle, or if you've seen American armies and battlefields in Europe, you've seen this slide, the German defensive positions. I won't say much on that other than that the Germans had multiple lines. And the real line where they were, if you want to say drawing a line in the sand, was the Kriemhildestellen, the Hindenburg line, and that's highlighted in red. And if you start over on the western side, it ran just north of Grand Pré, just south of Champagnole, went over to Roman, just south of Roman, and then north of Brühl, before crossing the Meuse River over towards Damvillers, or Damvier. There's not enough time to really do justice to the German combat training, but I wanted to put a few things in here. One is the Germans in 1917 adopted the defense in depth, and this was one reason for the initial strong AEF advance. The outpost zones that the Germans had were relatively small numbers, and it served as a warning zone. The Kampffeld, the battle zone, was, you had more units, and then you kept your reserve troops for counterattacking in the rear zones, and those you would put in and make significant counterattacks. So if you want to think about it in this way, one of the reasons we advanced so strongly at the beginning was the outpost zone and the battle zone were not that heavily manned. But then if you take a look at like the 35th Division AEF, for example, when the 52nd, when the German 52nd Infantry Division attacked around Exermont, that was a great example of the reserve troops hitting with a strong counterattack. The other thing I would say is by this point in 1918, the German army was essentially fighting a rear guard action. And for those of you that aren't military, that just means that, it was successive consecutive withdrawals to defense lines. There was no way with the numbers, as we saw, that they could hold everything and not lose ground. But what they were trying to do was to make it as, defend themselves as harsh as possible and make it as difficult for the Allies to advance as possible. And keeping liaison with flanks with flanking units is a priority. And we'll see that in an example in a few minutes. If you've read Ed Lingel's book, To Conquer Hell, and I really do like it, those of you who have traveled with me will know that I've actually, there are times when I take it with, and I'll read it on the spot because he's so descriptive of the specific battle at a specific location, and that is wonderful. But you also get the feeling that all the AEF did was just send inexperienced officers and inexperienced men into a killing machine. And there is some truth to that. But a researcher named Mark Groteleshin has done a book called The AEF Way of War. And what he looked at 4 experienced AEF divisions: the 1st, the 2nd, the 26th, and the 77th Division. And he wanted to see how they changed from Pershin's, shouldn't be doing that. He wanted to see how they changed from, he wanted to see how they changed from Pershin's concept of open warfare and how they met and understood the complications or that fighting environment that they were in and what kind of modifications they made. And so these are his key findings. And the second one is the one I'll emphasize here. The examination of these 4 divisions indicates not only that many American divisions experienced significant doctrinal adjustment, i.e. they changed from open warfare, and operational improvement during the war, but also that most practical and extensive learning occurred from the bottom up, at least with respect to divisions, corps, armies, and GHQ. As AEF units fought, they gained an appreciation for the limited set-piece attacks associated with trench warfare, and they proved increasingly capable of executing such attacks. So again, the Americans are moving up, or a significant number of them are moving up the learning curve, if you want to put it that way. But his third point was some divisional commanders such as Bullard, Summerall, and Lejeune were quick to understand the challenges of the Western Front and successful in transforming their divisions and their operational methods to meet those demands. But not all divisional officers learned the same lessons. The other thing I think that's true to say is a lot of those divisional commanders just didn't have the time. If your division had just arrived and if you were thrown into battle in mid-October, you're really at most you're fighting for 4 weeks of war. And his fourth point is the study shows the limitations of established doctrine in the fast-paced change of modern warfare. Doctrine such as open warfare is important, but it must evolve to remain applicable. So let's take a look at one example of innovation. Again, looking at the Meuse Argonne as, this being a case, Hunter Liggett being one of those leaders that showed an amazing ability, I think, to adapt to the circumstances. He was at the outbreak of the Meuse Argonne battle. He was the commanding officer of the First Corps. So he had, at the outbreak of the war, he had the 77th, the 28th, and the 35th Division. The 35th Division, when it broke down in the field after the German counterattack, was replaced with the 1st Division. So at this point, on the 6th of October, he had the 77th, the 28th, and the 1st Division in line, and he had the 82nd Division in reserve. What's happened is you can see a little bit from this map. Here's the German second position. Here's where the line was. So the 1st Division over here in the Aire River Valley had advanced and was far up here, but the 28th Division and the 77th Divisions were still getting hung up in the Argonne Forest without making significant progress. And for those of you that are Lost Battalion fans, here's where the Lost Battalion was, be in front of the jump-off line from the 2nd of October. So what he proposed to do on the 6th of October, he says, he pulled in his staff and he pulled in Generals McAndrew and Drum from General Headquarters and proposed to send the 82nd Division into what they call an oblique attack, to make an angled attack here into the Argonne Forest. The risk was that the Germans, if they caught wind and knew what was going on, they could come down with troops this way and just hit the right flank of the 82nd Division. But his staff didn't appreciate it because of the tight timetable. He was proposing this on the 6th of October, and he wanted the 82nd Division to move immediately and to be in line to attack on the 7th of October. But McAndrew and Drum approved it, so it did go forward. It was a success. The 82nd Division hit the German 2nd Landwehr Infantry Division and forced them northwards. And you can see that on this map. The numbers here, the 122nd, 120, 125th, these are the 3 German infantry regiments. So you can see how with the 28th Division, they were already bowed back a little bit. And this line here where I've got my cursor says as of the 6th of October, evening of the 6th of October. With the 82nd Division attacking, that line moved back, and I'll just say here's where the Lost Battalion area was roughly. By the midday on the 8th of October, the Germans are pushed back here, and by the evening of the 9th of October, the Germans are pushed all the way back there. So it did work. This is as close as I'm going to come to talking about the Lost Battalion, but This oblique attack actually took the pressure off the Lost Battalion and doesn't get a lot of credit for that. It also placed a certain doughboy named Alvin York into combat. And we know that story a little bit better. And it led to the rise of Hunter Liggett. So on the 12th of October, he resigns as commanding officer of 1st Corps. On the 16th, he's promoted on the 15th, and on the 16th, he becomes commanding officer of the American First Army. Pershin relinquishes that post, but obviously holds other titles. And one thing that he was known for is he didn't mind he didn't mind confronting Pershin and saying, we need to stop, we need to reorganize before we send our troops into battle again. So he was one of those that learned the value of the piecemeal attacks and preparation before just sending troops continually advancing. So in late October, what it led to is the troops were rested, refitted, and reorganized. And on the 1st of November, he launches the final offensive of the 3rd phase of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. So here's another Verdun connection. And again, we're just changing from one topic to the other. East Bank, West Bank, Falkenhayn, and Pershin. And this is what I kind of led off with on the teaser line for the presentation. Falkenhayn, when he was executing the Battle of Verdun, it begins on the 21st of February, 1916. And it initially is over on the east bank of the Meuse River. Just a couple of weeks after that, though, the Germans attack on the west bank of the Meuse River. And the biggest reason they did that was an attempt to neutralize heavy French artillery that was hitting them that was firing from the west bank over into the east bank of the Meuse River. 2 years later, the mirror opposite occurs. Pershin's battle was initially between the Meuse River and the Argonne forest. But because of German and Austrian heavy artillery on the heights of the Meuse, Pershin is forced to actually start an offensive on October 8th on the east bank of the Meuse River. So what's he do? You can see from the map here, he has the 33rd Division crossover. He has the 29th Division, and he has the French 18th Division, and all three of those attack and move up move up on the east bank of the Meuse River. I just find it interesting that you've got this, the old phrase "history repeats itself," or those who forget the past are doomed to relive it. Well, this is one of the cases where it worked just in mirror image. So let's talk a little bit about the phases of the Meuse-Argonne, and I love this map. When I found it in one of my reference books, which I actually got at the last year when we were out when we had the seminar at Kansas City. But what this shows is the initial layout, the initial jump off lines here, the 1st, the 5th, the 3rd Corps. And then it shows the initial progress made up through October 3rd is in that white area. So, the initial advance went relatively well, not as good on the Argonne Forest area, but in the other areas it went relatively well. Then the next major line here is October 30th. So you can see basically from October 3rd to October 30th, it was a real knockdown, drag out fight to advance beyond the Kriemhilde Stellung, the German Hindenburg line. And on the right, this little bit on the right, that's again where I mentioned on October 8th, where Pershin continued the advance on the other side of the Meuse River. And then if you go from November 1st to November 11th, you get all the way up here and you've got significant gains made. So again, to me, this map really shows graphically the three phases of the Meuse-Argonne and how brutal that second phase was. So penetrating the Hindenburg line, I'm going to read a little bit from American Armies and Battlefields in Europe, just a couple paragraphs. The 32nd Division on October 9th pushed forward. Sorry, let me stop and let me frame this. This is from the American Armies and Battlefields in Europe, the Battlefield Tour Guide book that I assume many of you have. And it assumes that you're in the Meuse, Argonne American Cemetery, just behind the chapel, looking south over the battlefield. The 32nd Division on October 9th pushed forward partway up the slopes of the Côte d'Armorique to the ridge in the rear of the Meuse, Argonne Cemetery Chapel, where it established itself in a trench of the Hindenburg line called on French wartime maps, the Tranchée de la Mamelle. Roman was reached in that attack, but a strong German counterattack drove the advancing forces back. Isolated groups of the 3rd Division, whose zone of action included the ground upon which the cemetery stands, entered the valley which runs through the cemetery and also entered Roman. The hostile fire was so severe that these groups did not attempt to hold, but took up position in the Tranchée de la Mamelle along the 32nd Division. The remainder of the 3rd Division to the right rear from here made a substantial advance also. And after dark, the 80th Division on the right of the 3rd entered Cunel, the village seen to the right when looking along the front of the chapel. Elements of the division were fighting in the town at midnight, but it was not captured on that night. And it continues for several paragraphs talking about the fighting that continued on the 10th and the 11th. Finally, on the 12th and 13th, the divisions consolidated their gains. That's how long and how brutal it was trying to break through the Hindenburg line. And here's another very convoluted graph, but it has a lot of information. Hopefully you can see it large enough. I can also send it to people afterwards, etc. But this looks at the AEF casualties by division. So along the top line, I've got each of the divisions listed. Whoops, I shouldn't do that. On the left-hand side, you've got the dates starting from the 26th of September through the 11th of November. And on the right, you have totals. And here's what I did. In 1944, the American Battle Monuments Commission published a summary of operations for each of the divisions that fought. But they all had different blocks of time. They didn't all have a unified time when they would list casualties. So if there were 5 days and 400 casualties, what I did was for those 5 days, I listed 80 casualties each. So it's an assumption, but it at least gives you graphically or directionally the right numbers of casualties. So what you see here, red is the worst, the highest number of casualties. Green is the lightest number of casualties. So in the initial phase, that 26th of September to the 30th of September, you see the units or the AEF overall having 4,000 plus casualties. And if you look at the individual divisions, it's led by the 35th Division, which is a well-known story. Second by the 79th Division. Then you've got the 91st Division also taking fairly hefty casualties. So you can see that some of these green divisions taking the highest casualties of the 37th Division too. And that leading to the huge casualty numbers right at the beginning. And then for a brief time from 1st October through 2nd and 3rd, you get to a lighter numbers because the pace of battle has stopped. The units are, they're moving units in and out. The 35th is moved out, the 1st Division is moved in, etc. And then when the second phase begins on the 4th of October, you're back to a range of about 3,300 casualties per day. And that goes well into mid-October. And then in mid-October, it starts to wane a little bit, especially in the end of October, when, by which time Hunter Liggett has been made the commander-in-chief of the American First Army, and he orders the units to relax or to rest and refit and get ready for the 1st of November. So you can see by the end of October, the absolute end, the 28th, 29th, you've got casualty rates of only 900 some per day. Then move to the 1st and 2nd of November. On those 2 days, boom, you're at 3,100 casualties again. And after that, it drops off significantly as the Germans are on the run. Remember that I showed the slide about the German and Allied effective rifle strength. So you can clearly see we punched them, how would be the best way to put it? We punched them and had a real heavy brawl in the first part of October, the first 3 weeks of October. After that, we pretty much, by that time, the camel's back was broke. And we can advance with relatively fewer casualties. Wanted to just try to get some information on the influenza, and if I had had time, there's more sources I could locate, but this is what I had. This is a look at, give me 1 second here. This is a look at the evacuations by hospital trains from the main line, or evacuations by hospital units from the battlefield back to hospitals. And I circled the area for the Argonne forest for wounded, sick, and gassed. And the point I wanted to make here was 36% are sick. And you have to assume, I mean, there are other reasons for that, but the bulk of that was the influenza and the impact of the influenza. So on about 36% of those evacuations back to a hospital came from the result of influenza, depending on how it was classified. This is just comparative casualties. The AEF had a total of 120,000 casualties. For those of you not so military minded, casualties are killed, wounded, and missing. And we had 26,277 dead. The Germans had 126,000 casualties, including 28,000 dead. But what was interesting is 26,000 of those became prisoners of war. So again, as conditions deteriorated, Alexander Watson, in his book, and I just drew a blank on it, Enduring the Great War, Combat Morale and Collapse in the British and German armies, 1914 to 1918. He proposes that one of the things that led to the disintegration of the German army in that late October, early November time period was that German officers were surrendering en masse with their men, and just because they knew that the war was over. You know, the propaganda machine was still urging them to fight on, et cetera, but they knew they may not have totally free news, but they certainly knew that in front of them was continually more and more fresh troops, and no matter what they did. And so they started to surrender in larger numbers. So that's an interesting point, if that indeed has happened, in terms of how the numbers went down so rapidly, beginning, I would say, in mid-October to the end of the fighting. Putting the Meuse Argonne in the geographic context of late 1918, this map, the dotted line here is the front line more or less on the 25th of September, before any of the offensives that were launched there. The little dots here was the front line on November 17th. So this triangle represents more or less the Meuse Argonne, the area that the Americans took in the Meuse Argonne. And the point I would make here is, when we describe the fighting, and it's very American-centric description, but when you take a look at the advance of the British, the Belgians, and the French, they made significantly further gains. And you can argue that we got the worst piece of property to advance from, and there's some truth in that. But nevertheless, they did make further gains. So I just thought that putting it in the context of coalition warfare and what our true contribution was. But you also have to look a little bit larger at the AEF contribution. And there are 6 different operations listed here and numbers of divisions, et cetera. It's a very complicated thing. So while I'm talking, hopefully you can look at that and read a few of the details. And maybe what I should have done is had a magnifying glass for everybody, or send everyone a magnifying glass. But yeah, you had the Ein Marne in from the 18th of July to the 6th of August. You had the Oise from the August 18th through, it started out, and you had a few divisions there. You had American divisions on the Somme, 2 American divisions. You had American divisions fighting in Ypres, in the Ypres-Liz salient. You had the Saint-Mihiel offensive, and you had the Meuse-Argonne. So there was, yeah, we did do more contribution. But again, you know, the shaded gray areas are Saint-Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne, and it definitely looks small in terms of absolute miles relative to the rest of the map. So going to take a little bit of a battlefield approach now and talk to a few things. Most of you have all been to the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery. But one of the things that I don't think people always realize or you forget is the location, the significance of the location. As when I was talking about penetrating the Hindenburg line, you know, this was area that the 3rd Division held and captured during the right at the Kriemhildestellung at the German Hindenburg line, and that was the significance of why they located it where they located it. The post-war, there were over 26,000 burials prior to any repatriation, and the government decided that the next of kin could decide to keep their soldiers either buried overseas or return them home. So roughly 40% of them were returned home. And today there's 14,246 burials and 954 missing commemorated at the cemetery. The only larger American Battle Monuments Commission cemetery is the Manila, in terms of burials, is the Manila American Cemetery, and that has 17,184. And the reason why that's larger is because that represents largely the entire South Pacific campaign in World War II. So most people don't realize, Sal touched on it too, the size of this cemetery. I mean, if you ask most people, they would say, oh yeah, Normandy Cemetery is larger than the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery. It's not. And the cemetery superintendent was Bruce Malone, and he's been posting a lot of photos in the Meuse-Argonne Facebook group, and this was one that I borrowed from that. So let's talk about the Zone Rouge and reforestation. Saint-Mihiel, Verdun, and the Meuse-Argonne is what I would call a special place in terms of World War I battles. And I did not realize that until I started spending the 6 months over there in 2017 and the additional 2 months in 2018. Large parts of France, the Western Front, were declared Zone Rouge in that they were unfit for resettlement or agriculture after World War I. It was either just too many unexploded munitions, and or just the ground was way too toxic and too poisonous. And the French struggled with this on a variety of ways. And in the late 20s and early 30s, the National Forest Office was tasked with planting trees to help nature reclaim the ground. The map that I show here is from a German friend of mine, Marcus Klauer. He's worked with a group on Mort Homme, and they put up a signpost of a walkway of 10 signs. And this shows their walkway in parcel number 153, just a small piece of Le Mort Homme. But it also describes, and it's hard to read on the bottom, the plantings, the tree plantings, the different types. You had beeches, you had spruces, you had ash in some area, you had mixus when they put this in. So we're going to get to that in the next slide. But what this reforestation did was it helped preserve bunkers and trench lines in a way that you don't find on the Somme or Ypres, where so much has been given back to the agricultural. I mean, yes, you have preserved areas there, but you don't have near the numbers of going out into the woods and still seeing the original bunkers, still seeing original foxholes, etc. The negative side of it is it obstructed the historical view such as the view between the Verdun forts. So you can't see that now. What's happening today in the last couple of years, but really increasing the last year and this year, is the bark beetle, or what the French call scolie, is the warmer weather and the less rain that they've been having has been a huge increase in the bark beetle damaging, and this is hitting especially the softwoods in those areas. So in the areas where spruces were planted, it's hitting some ash, etc. The Grand Est region of France has been hard hit, but other battlefields from World War II as well, the Hurtgen Forest and other areas. The French response is called l'abattage, which in English would be slaughter. They're cutting down the infected trees, and the idea is they'll cut them down and then they will replace them over time with more resistant species. The problem is when they move in with their heavy equipment, this destroys many of the remaining trench lines and bunkers that you can see. So for those of you that have been fortunate enough to go over to the Western Front, and for those of you that have been not gutsy enough, but for those of you that have gotten off the beaten path and gone into the woods, you know, a lot of those areas now are threatened and can see severe damage as things happen, as the French continue to move against the bark beetle. So in summary, let me just read through these and then give my own little perspective. Paul Bram from his Meuse-Argonne, the Test of Battle. It's concluded that the Meuse-Argonne campaign was a decisive action. It contributed to Allied victory, but it was not the only nor most decisive offensive of the war. For the Americans, it was a hard-won victory and won only in the last stages and at great cost of lives. It was a victory produced mostly by improperly trained leaders and soldiers, and it was won by determination, esprit, and the exhaustion of the enemy. The victory was a tribute to the vitality and strength of the United States when sorely tried. And David Sebecki from the General's War says, it's true that by the time the American 1st and French 4th armies were finally within the range of the Meuse Railroad, the Germans were in a complete state of collapse because their right flank had caved in. The fighting in the Meuse-Argonne had drawn in 47 divisions and the last of Germany's reserves. And as the Germans tried to contain the Americans and the French on their left, they were forced to weaken their right wing correspondingly. Said another way in that last sentence, that made it possible for the British to make the gains that the British had when you take a look at the map. And putting it in my own words, and kind of drawing all of these little bits and pieces that I've talked about together, the reason I find the Meuse-Argonne so fascinating and the AEF role in those last stages of the war, these quotes emphasize that the winning of the war required a multinational effort. It wasn't just Americans. They don't identify the Meuse-Argonne as the victorious battle of the war, but certainly an important one. They don't equate doughboy bravery with victory, but they do praise the bravery and recognize the bravery that we did put in, and unfortunately the lives lost. They emphasize the steep learning curve of the AEF, and they also emphasize the importance of the German exhaustion. And I think that more or less sums up and what I was saying, the Meuse-Argonne in a different light. It's hard to describe, but I think a lot of Americans see it as the American battle and the battle that won the war. And we don't really pay enough attention to the coalition nature of the warfare, to the exhaustion of the Germans, etc., to the own weakness that we had. I mean, we certainly had bravery, but the learning curve was very steep, much like it was for the new British divisions in 1915. So here I've got a few of my favorite Meuse-Argonne books, and I'll just give a minute for that. And here's just closing information. I do have a website called MeuseArgonne.com. The Facebook group is a Facebook group with the same name, MeuseArgonne.com, that's very active with over 2,000 members. My battlefield tour company is called kneedeepintohistory.com, and you can reach me here. At this point, I'm gonna turn it back to Melanie, and I'll stop the screen sharing and we can go back to questions and answers. or maybe I'll actually leave the presentation open because I'm sure someone might want to have, might want me to move to a slide.
Yeah, Randy, maybe you could, oh, sorry, there's a little bit of an echo. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Yeah, okay, there was a funny echo for a second. So I see a couple of questions about getting a copy of the slides. So Randy, I'll leave that to you about sending the presentation on an individual basis.
Okay.
But we will, or Randy, if that's okay with you, I can send it out. But just so everybody knows, we will be putting the video of the meeting up on our YouTube channel. So you'll also be able to see it there and share it with anyone who you think might be interested, or look at it again for your own information, take a closer, slower look at some of the maps. I should be able to have, depending on how long it takes Zoom to process the video, I should have that up by early this coming week. So just keep an eye out on the YouTube channel. I will put the YouTube channel link in the chat right here. And if you need it again, just please feel free to email me. I'll just put my
And anyone that wants to email me, I'll send a copy. I can send a copy of the slides too. Let's do it that way.
And so I'm going to just change my view a little bit here so that I can see everybody more easily. So we have a big group today. And if you do want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself. You have that capability, but just please do mute yourself again when you finish speaking, just so that we can cut down on any feedback or background noise. You can just raise your hand, or kind of wave your hand or raise your hand. I should be able to see you. I think I'm able to see everybody on one screen. Yes. And oh, sorry, one more thing to add. I know that many of you are on non-video mode. So obviously I can't see you if you're not on video mode. So if you would like to speak, just speak up, because otherwise I won't know if you want to ask a question. So Sal, I do see you waving your hand, so go ahead.
All right, I just want to thank Randy for doing a superb job of giving us the details. I know for a lot of people, battlefield explanations can be very difficult and sometimes even boring. But Randy, you did a great job of making it, showing about how we were involved. And remember, there was a German expression at the end of World War I that the Americans were brand new and green, but they were the fastest learners. And they gave us that credit. But there was also something else that affecting, I think, German morale, is that there were already defeats in Balkans. They had surrendered, the Bulgarians surrendered, and in the Italian Alps, the loss of the Hungarian, or the Austro-Hungarian battle there. So those were a couple of days or 3 days before the German final surrender. But nevertheless, Randy, I knew you would give us a great presentation, and I want to thank you from my deepest well that you did a superb position. Take care.
Thanks, Sal. Thanks for forcing me to do this. No, it made me do something that I was putting off for a while, and so it was good in that sense. One of my favorite books written by an American is Victory Must Be Ours, and it's written by Lawrence Moyer, and it talks about the German side of World War I, which is actually a very fascinating thing to see, especially that decline in 1918. As you know, they entered the war. They entered that year with the hope that they would have victory on the Western Front because of the ability to move most of the troops from the Eastern Front, and it just didn't work out, and they just exhausted themselves to a fair degree before the U.S. could enter the war. But they still were able to fight a very skilled rearguard action in the last months of the war.
Any other, Jack, go ahead.
You were a German soldier in 1918. You'd spend some time looking over your shoulder and looking at your line of retreat because you knew you were going to do that. If you were in the British territory, you have a long way to go to get back to Germany through Metz. which is probably the reason why the Germans spent so much of their reserves trying to protect the Meuse Argonne, because it was the gateway back to Germany for its retreating troops. So one of the reasons I think that the British had advanced so far is because they had a hard time keeping up with the Germans as they retreated.
I think you're right to some degree, and I think you know, I didn't really focus on the Meuse, the railway that ran just north of the Meuse Argonne and the importance of that, but I think David Zabecki, in the summary, he kind of brings that point to life. You know, as the Germans tried to contain the Americans and the French on their left, they were forced to weaken their right wing correspondingly. So that in part helped the British to advance a little bit further, because the Germans had put down several divisions into the Meuse Argonne area just to geographically try to protect that rail line that ran east-west for their units. So I think you're right, and that's another point. Unfortunately, in a 45, 50-minute presentation, you can't hit every point.
Randy, I don't know if you can see it in the chat, but Ron is asking, what about English and French battle exhaustion?
That's a good question. The Americans like to complain about the French 4th Army on the left in the Champagne, and the fact that that they weren't advancing in some cases as fast and weren't keeping liaison with the Americans. There's some truth to that, but again, when you look at that map, I'll say that maps don't lie, and so they did end up taking more territory. We did end up giving the French 2 divisions to help fight in the Champagne. The 2nd Division attacked at Mont Blanc, and after they were pulled out, I don't remember how many days they were in the line, but after they were pulled out, the 36th Division went in and continued. But remember that one American division is approximately two European divisions, or a little bit more than 2 European divisions. So it's still not the bulk of the French forces there. And I would say that the best book, I haven't really looked on the French side, but on the British side, I really do recommend Alexander Watson's Enduring the Great War, Combat Morale and Collapse in the German and British Armies. And for a variety of reasons, the British were able to hold it together and hold it together economically. And in part, that was because of the blockade, which certainly played a role in the deterioration of the German home front. But that's a good look at just the British and the German side throughout the war.
Thanks. Chuck, go. And just a quick note: I put I've repasted the name of the book that Randy just mentioned in the bottom of the chat, so you should be able to see it right in the most recent chat there. Chuck, go ahead.
So Randy, assuming that the Germans did capture some American prisoners during these campaigns, how did the German treatment of American prisoners change from, early 1918, when the first American prisoners were probably captured, to the armistice?
I don't have a good answer for that. One little bit of information that I do have is one of my clients in 2017 or 2018, her grandfather became a POW in, I want to say it was in early October, and he ended up in Landau in Germany by the end of the war, before he was released. And so we actually went back to the area where that POW camp was situated. With a little bit of luck in the German archives in the city of Landau, I was able to locate the area. I don't know how it changed. I really can't answer. One point that Alexander Watson makes is that, and this is part of his thesis of the fact that the Germans were surrendering with officers in large groups, because if you surrendered as an individual American, and the unit you surrendered to had just seen a heck of a lot of tough fighting, chances are your life outlook may be quite limited. And that was true on both sides. The Americans certainly, there are enough stories about Americans taking people a couple hundred feet back and then coming back a little early rather than taking the prisoners all the way back to the POW pen. So I would say that, during the intense fighting on both sides, it probably, there were definitely cases on both sides of prisoners getting, summarily executed and not being, removed. Just because, the demands of war, you just didn't have the time or the manpower or energy to do it.
I have another question from someone. Go ahead, please.
Randy, you told me once, but I forgot. How long did it take for the Germans to leave after November 11th? And what did they take with them and what did they leave behind?
Oh boy, I didn't prepare for that one. That's a trick question, Susan. They had, I believe it was, I'd have to look at the specific terms. I think it was 14 days from starting on the 11th of November to get back to withdrawal, to get back behind the Rhine River in Germany. And they had to also give up, there were 3 bridgeheads on the Rhine River. Cologne was the British one, Mainz was the French one, and Koblenz was the American one. And that was a range of 30, they had to be 30 kilometers behind east of that. So 30 kilometers was 18 miles. So essentially the Germans did leave a lot of things on the ground and they destroyed a lot of their, I'd have to go back to look at the individual things that they had to turn over as a result of the armistice. But it was just a real mess to get back that quickly and that far.
I thought they were.
Sorry, Randy, it looks like Jim has something to add. And I think if somebody else, it looks like a couple people might have something to add to that question.
Okay.
So Jim, go ahead. And then there was one other person, and I'm sorry I didn't see you.
Yeah, let me add to that. Is part of the Paris Peace Conference, or part of the armistice agreements, said that the German army had to pull back to all acquired territory by December 31st. And they managed to do that. So it had to pull back all the equipment. Some of it they couldn't carry because the transport, the animals, and the trucks were broken down, but they did it in good order. And that was arranged by a German general named Gruner, who replaced Ludendorff. And Gruner was picked because he was a logistics genius and moved over to the Western Front to control, manage the German army. And the pullback by December 31st is really considered a logistical masterpiece. So I just wanted to add that they had to do that by December 31st.
You also, at the same time, you had, you had Soviets, you had soldiers' councils being drawn up in some of the divisions and stuff. But by and large, even those divisions, or where you had Soviets or soldiers' councils being formed, they still largely followed the officers because they knew they had to get back over to Germany behind, to meet that deadline. Otherwise, they were in trouble. Because if you didn't make it by the deadline, I believe you could be interned as a prisoner of war for an undetermined amount of time.
Any other questions? Andrew, go ahead. I think you're muted, Andrew. If you could just unmute yourself at the, yeah, thank you. I can do it if you're having some trouble. Let's see. There you go. Go ahead.
I'm good. Randy, could you talk about the Meuse Argonne Cemetery? The fact that there were 2,400 temporary cemeteries to begin with. Were those 8 larger cemeteries not established until after the American Battlefield Monuments Commission was established in 23? And how was that done?
Good question. I don't remember the full answers on that, but the Lisa Boudreau did a book called Bodies of War, which does talk about it and talks about the commemoration, the whole American effort of commemoration relative to the other allies. So I would say look at Lisa Boudreau's Bodies of War book. The Americans did take a different approach than the others in that we amalgamated everyone in each of the major theaters of operation. We formed one large cemetery where the British, the French, the Germans, the Belgians, they have more individual cemeteries. Now, that's not entirely true because some of the British were cemeteries, a lot of the German cemeteries were amalgamated, but certainly the Americans were the ones that really were the standout in the sense of there's one major cemetery and one major memorial in each of the major offensive areas.
Thank you.
So I hope I answered your question.
I'd like to add to that if I could. I worked for the American Battle Monuments Commission for 10 years, and the parades registration was an Army problem for a long time, and the American Battle Monuments Commission wasn't formed to maintain the cemeteries. They didn't take over the cemeteries until between the wars. The American Battle Monuments Commission was formed to control the construction of the out of control private memorials that people were putting up all over the place. Divisions were putting up monuments without any regard to historical accuracy or aesthetics or who owned the land or anything else, and it was a real problem. And so that's why ABMC was formed. So the Army actually managed all of the consolidation of the temporary cemeteries into the main cemeteries, and ABMC didn't take that over until much later. I don't have the date in my head right now. I can look it up, but that's how that worked.
Thank you. I know several of the memorials and stuff weren't completed until around 1937. I just remember seeing on Facebook, I think we just celebrated the anniversary of the Chateau Thierry American Memorial just last week one day. And that was completed, I believe, in 37.
I'd like.
Yes.
Oh, Chuck, he disappeared. Oh, he's back. Chuck and then Andrew.
All right, I was just wondering, Randy, if I could just see the rifle strength slide, and then after that, the percentage front covered by the Allies, the two
Sure.
slides, just for like a minute each.
Yep. So let me see here. Now I got to remember the order I put them in. Okay, there is the rifle strength.
Okay.
And the book that was out of, the book that a lot of these was out of was Military History of the World War by a man named McEntee. And I was just fortunate enough to pick it up. It's dated 1943. I was fortunate to pick it up at the last year when we were at the seminar in Kansas City.
Okay.
And what was the other slide you wanted to see?
The other one is the percentage front covered by the different allies over time.
Sure. Yep. And the data for that is in the Q&A of American Armies and Battlefields in Europe. I don't have the page number right off the top of my head, but there was a number given in there were numbers given in that for the various dates, and that's what I pulled it off of.
Oh, that's great. It's a beautiful slide. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I still, 500 plus pages, 600 pages, and I'm still learning new things in the American Battle Monuments Commission, American Armies and Battlefields in Europe book. It's just such a great resource on statistics and things. And this was one of the gems when you actually sat down to figure out the percentage.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Andrew, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask the lady who worked for the American Battlefield Monuments Commission what her job was there, and was she working abroad or here in the States?
I think she has.
No, I'm here. I'm just
Okay.
trying to push my right button. There we go. I worked for the American Battle Monuments Commission in Paris from 1998 till 2008 in the engineering section, and I was doing engineering projects, but I just kind of stumbled into the fact that I was one of the only American in the section, and the private memorials action was in that section. So I ended up answering all the letters when people came across monuments that looked terrible, that basically saying, sorry, it's not our job. We don't have the mission or the funding to maintain those memorials. And I started a little database and started collecting information on these monuments. And after 10 years, I was growing increasingly frustrated with that because I wasn't able to really take any action to do anything for these private memorials, except make excuses why we couldn't. So I actually quit the American Battle Monuments Commission in 2008 in order to start a nonprofit called American War Memorials Overseas that some of you may be familiar with. Our website is uswarmemorials.org, and we have a database there where we're trying to gather all these monuments in a database. We're trying to encourage cultural tourism to these places, and then we're trying to find maintenance solutions where no maintenance solutions exist.
Yeah, I
still live in Europe, and I still work closely with the American Battle Monuments Commission on these projects.
I wanted to respond back to her. Now that I saw her name, I recognized her because we had a picture taken together at the Samuel.
We did indeed. Yeah.
100. Yes, good to see you again.
You were also probably both guests at the meet and greet dinner that Marcus Clower and I put together.
Yeah, yeah.
On what was it, September 21st, I think, in 2018.
Yes, absolutely.
So thank you for what you do.
Lillian, if you want to type in, or the in the comments the website too. I mean, and feel free to say it one more time.
I'm typing in the comments right now. What I'm actually doing, I've got this book, War and Remembrance, in front of me, trying to look up exactly when ABMC took over the monuments. I'm up. It's sometime in 1938 or 1939 is when they finally took over the cemeteries. But this book, War and Remembrance by Thomas Connor, was recently published, and it's a really nice history of the American Battle Monuments Commission. I will type both of those things into comments right now.
Thanks, Lillian.
Randy, a quick comment from Ron. It would be interesting to add German POWs to the German numbers graph. Just a quick note from Ron.
Oh,
there.
Yes. No, that's, and that could be done because these two slides, the British, I'm looking at the numbers here, it looks like they had 188,000 prisoners. The French got 139. The Americans, now again, this is from July 18th through November 11th. The Americans got about 40,000. So yeah, if you just do a real quick math, 350,000, give or take. Out of that, the difference, going back to this, you've got to give or take a $600,000 difference. So 350,000, if I'm right, were prisoners. So that's, I'm looking at the change here, but relative to, let's say if you take from June 1st, the 1,639 German riflemen, if you take more or less 350,000 of that, if you put the two slides together, I see the point that he's trying to make. It would help you understand, and especially the timing of those prisoners was much more in October and November than in August and September. The German army didn't feel itself defeated at that point yet.
And Randy, I just wanted to add real quick, kind of to follow on what Lillian said. There's some of you might know the French sociologist Pierre Nora, who writes about memory and history. I think this is the English title of his most famous work. The French title is The Places of Memory. And I'm not going to put the accent just because it's a little bit, there's already enough going on. But if you're interested in some of the sociological aspects of how people remember events, that's another good work to consult.
Well, I think this has been a great program, and Randy, I just appreciate all your effort. And I'm sorry I had to corral you to get into this, but yeah, you put us all on notice and how much there is to know about this war, and continue.
Thanks, Al. I mean, it really is a fascinating battle, and the whole AEF, the interaction with the Allies, it's very fascinating. And I just feel, sometimes we're a little bit too American-centric to not look at the bigger picture and not look at the German side as much. So hopefully that I brought a little bit of that to you today.
All right, thank you very much, and I appreciate this, and I welcome everybody, and next month we'll have another one, and I hope we could have as many people as this one in attendance.
Do you have a date, Sal, for the November meeting?
Yes, that would be in November. It would be the 14th of November.
Okay, great. So yeah, as soon as we have the details, I'll send out the information and then the reminders as well. If again, these meetings are free and open to anybody. So if you have friends who would be interested, please let them know. Bruce, go ahead.
Yeah. How many people did attend?
38.
Actually, I think there a couple snuck in toward the end, so I think we had closer to 43.
Cool. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you, Randy.
You're welcome.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else, Sal, or Randy, before I close it out?
Nope.
No, I have nothing else. No.
Okay.
Thanks, billions.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. See you in November.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.